Welcome back to another reading and correcting of Stepping Up by me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, Tiger Supervisor. And today we are doing chapter 56. Tibs linked into Terrino's office and she raised an eyebrow, looking him over. He had a black eye, a split lip, more injuries she couldn't see. He had them wrapped in his essence, but broken and dislocated bones were still painful. Training, he told her, motioning for the seat. She nodded, and he gingerly took it. Do you want me to call a cleric? I'll rest until my next run, and I'll get healed at the door. She smiled. You want me to get one, then? It closed its door and to graduate. It's part of why I asked to see you. If Stowe was graduating, it was time for him to prepare for his trip to the Purity Dungeon, and not having injuries would help. He nodded. She took the messaging crystal from the desk and Tibs sensed it and inadvertently the room. There was a lot of essence in the walls. He knew the guild building was protected by it, but with 7 elements he could sense, he had a better sense of how tightly it was woven. And even if there was so much he still couldn't differentiate. Even the desk was composed of a weave so tight, Tibs wondered if essence was all it was made of. The door opened a few seconds after she put the crystal away, and a young man in the white cleric's robe entered, pressed hand on Tibs, causing all his pain to vanish from life. On top of being able to move without problems, he felt as if he'd just stepped out of bed. Tyrannia placed a bracelet with a yellow gem on the desk. I know you don't like having your status acknowledged, which is why I'm doing this here. That's the bracelet we get so we can leave the town. Yes. And once the dungeon is ready for runners again, it will turn red. Unlike those others will receive, this one will not turn black, it will turn green. What does that mean? It means that instead of paying a reward for the return of the bracelet, regardless of if you are attached to it or not, we will only do so if you are with it and unarmed. This bit off his protest. He was heading into a dungeon with no idea of how long it would take to get in or get his audience once inside. Understand, Tibs, that this is a show of trust I've never given a run. The glimmering eyes were fixed on me. But you protected a dungeon at the risk of your life. You went beyond what I'd expect an adventurer would. And Harry keeps complaining about how you are taking over his job. You care for the people here. I see a great future for you as an adventurer. Silence stretched, and Tibs wondered if she'd expect him to respond. But I understand the temptation freedom represents. She continued, if you run, I will see to your punishment myself. And the trust I am showing you will never be shown again, not even if you nearly kill yourself in a dungeon a second time. She pushed the bracelet toward him. So treat this with the respect it deserves. Placed it around his wrist and snapped it shut. The pain was sharp and immediate, and once it passed, the bracelet was tight against the skin. She smiled. Keep it covered until the gathering is called in a few hours and stay at the back so no one will notice. Then you can enjoy your travels. All right. This I'm going to try to change. I'm not sure why I wrote those scenes out of order. This scene was them arriving in the new city, and then there was a flashback to the gathering. So, but the odds are I just didn't think to do the gathering first. Yeah. The gathering before the closed dungeon went much like the previous one, except that instead of guards moving through the runners, handing out bracelet, they had to line up before the tables, where their names were checked against the list. As far as Tibs saw, everyone who had survived Stowe's rampage got one. and to his surprise, a few of the recruits also received one. There were fights among the recruits as some without bracelet tried to take one from another as they walked away, but the only thing they got was guard taking them away. Ew, that's clunky. There were fights among the recruits as some without bracelet tried to take from one. Tried to steal one? Yeah, you know what? Yeah, try to steal one. But the only thing they got were guards taking them away. The recruit had to put it on before leaving the table, and once on, it could not. It could only be removed with essence. Harry stood to the side as a man explained what the closure meant and how they didn't know how long it would be, and then the bracelet would tell them. And then the bracelet would tell them to return and the deadly consequences of not returning. The guard leader glared at all of them, and chose the recruits, and Tibs had the sense he couldn't wait. So he no longer had to deal with any of them. 2 weeks is what the men said they could expect, even if it might be longer or shorter. No two dungeon took the same amount of time when it came to graduating. Not thinking 1 in 8 days would be enough, they sneaked to the mountain in the night and asked Stowe to remain closed longer for 1 month, and discovered that, like Tibs, when he arrived here, Stowe didn't know what a month was, or even what a day was, since Stowe didn't see or sense the sun, Taurus or Claria. Tibs had to resort to the nightly closure of Stowe's door. Stowe wasn't aware he closed it as the sun set, and asked for 5 and 0 of those. His had to be that would be enough time. Jekyll had opted to stay in Craggle Rock, both to be with Crosif and to keep an eye on his father. With so many runners away, his friend expected him to trust. Maz had to go to his home with his betrothed, and Cumdar stated he was never setting foot in that city again unless it was to watch it burn. Karina had glared but hadn't commented. The sky was gray when the world came into focus again. Karina pulled him off the platform, breaking his concentration as he tried to tease apart the difference in how using the platform felt compared to the doorway still made. The tingling was there, but unlike with the doorway, he couldn't work out its source. When the rain registered as the cold water seeped through his clothing, then it no longer reached in or Karina as he wilted away. Welcome to Kadalisanyan, she said, where I promise the sun will shine eventually. It rains a lot here. The ocean is a few leagues that way, and the mountain is over there. The wind pushes the humidity here, and it accumulates until she motions around them, forgotten how comforting the sound of falling rain was. The sounds of home for you, she smiled. What's the sound of your home? He remembered the screams, the fight, the yelling of the guards, and laughter. Nothing worth talking about. As with nearly every platform he stepped off, it opened to a marketplace full of colors and 20 languages. The rain didn't keep the merchants from yelling to entice visitors to their booth, and the awning served as another attraction as people used them to step out of the rain. The one he understood as they passed praised the bowl she sold as the best for getting hot water, as well as her selection of teas to go with them. He looked over at the bundles of leaves and kept from asking why there were so many kinds. He was here for the dungeon, not satisfying his curiosity. He was surprised at how not white the buildings were. Mountain Sea was more white than this city. How could a city next to a purity dungeon be so drab? What's wrong? Rena asked, following his gaze into an alley that was covered with so much filth it qualified as having hills. How come it's so dirty? It's a city. Dirt happens, she answered casually. But it's a purity city. Doesn't that mean anything? She chuckled. It means everyone is helping the dungeon, directly or not, just like in Craggle Rock. But purity. Just imagine he sounded like Jacko when he said, "But we won," as an excuse for the stupid thing he'd done. Dungeon's power doesn't extend over the city, you know that. Stowe is sensing further as he gets more powerful. Yes, the dungeon's influence grows as they age, but fortunately not very far from the mountain they live in. We don't want it to reach the city. We would be able to create creatures in our home where, when we're off working, every building would become a room in the dungeon. She slowed and looked at the people. Even knowing dungeons don't exist to eat us, it's still not something I'd want. No one here would be ready for that. They'd still die as it tested everyone, and most failed. Normal people aren't ready for a run. So this is just a city like the one where my street is? He asked in disappointment. You really thought it was different? The way you talk about dungeon cities and the way Kindar hates this one, thought purity had more of an influence. His problem is like mine, I think, she said pensively, if exasperated by what he is. I'm an aberration in my family. Well, everyone with a link to purity will see him as one. If I'd seen the error of my ways and joined the folds of my family instead of sneaking off ever deeper into the library, I would have been welcomed back. He never will. If his family ever acknowledged him, it would be to hand him over to the fighters for execution. But you could explain things, you said. It's not like what he does goes against the clerics here. You're wrong, she said with a mix of sadness and anger. We're taught from the moment we were old enough to understand the stories that before purity made the clerics, madness covered the world. That the other elements used their agent to sow chaos, ascension, and outright madness. That it, through us, brought peace to the world. What I've seen of the world isn't particularly peaceful. And the stories explain that by saying there are still agents of the other elements in the world working against purity, that we have to be vigilant lest one day chaos and horror will return. Do you believe those stories? He looked around to keep from pressing her as she stayed silent. They walked long enough you expected they'd cross into a different neighborhood with changes in the houses to represent them, but they were all similar in their ordinariness. Some were 3 stories, those seemed to be mostly shops. Some were 2, but even they had a lack of refinement that made them more like the one-story houses than different. Tibs associated plainness with streets. His and others he visited in his search were places where coins were too rare for anyone to improve the buildings. He thought that anyone for whom coins were a normal thing would use them to make their homes look better, feel better. He hadn't seen any houses in disrepair yet, but also nothing beyond the essential of what made a building. I questioned them, she said, snapping his attention back to her, even before meeting Control. I didn't understand why my family was against me reading from the library until I found books contradicting the stories I grew up. The sorcerers of purity don't interact with the clerics because they know too much that would challenge their beliefs. They need to be effective. Because the guards spend so much time with the clerics, they too can't know too much. What about rogues and archers? She smiled. We don't have much of one and none of the other. She paused. Or so we are told. There are archers within the guards, so I expect that is what class they are. And as guards, they will be limited in what they can learn. And the rogues? Tibs asked, then stopped to watch a man in a uniform that made Tibs think he was a guard. Man in a uniform. Tibs think he was a guard. to watch a man in your farm talking to a penitent look. A man in your farm that made Tibs think he was a guard talking to a penitent looking woman. Tibs didn't understand the words, but the tone was that of a lecture. He's chastising her for sitting there when there is work to do, and I explained. Wouldn't it be her decision? It's her coin to make or not. She watched the exchange for a second more. Have you listened to the clerics in Cradle Rock? They don't say much when they heal us as we leave the dungeon. There was that old guy when the corruption pull happened, but he just screamed to have Kumdar thrown into a cell for help. The rest of the time they keep to themselves. But they remembered one. There was a young cleric, and she was trying to get rid of the poor. She seemed determined to remove the corruption, even if the attempt killed her. Kirina nodded. Hard work is one of the core tenets of purity, and the clerics adhere to it more than any here. She nodded to the woman who stepped into the house now that the guard was done reprimanding her. Everyone here lives under Durston. You are more likely to be stopped for vagrancy here than larceny. At least with theft, you are working towards something. She smiled at him and as Tibs eyed a high window. You will still be arrested if you're caught. It liked the refinement that added purchase, but it also didn't have any work done that made reaching it more difficult. I'm not walking the roofs here. They've started walking again. What I have to do is more important. Then be sure to keep your fingers out of others' pockets. They aren't any kinder to pickpockets than they are elsewhere. But they'll be kinder to me than to a vagrant? Tibbs asked, grinning. Barely. She motioned ahead. We're nearly there. We're nearly here. The only difference Tibbs saw in the houses here, compared to the rest of their walk, was that they seemed slightly larger. Or maybe it was his imagination. She stopped before the door and smoothed her robe down. She looked Tibbs over as if the good set of clothing she'd forced onto him might not be good enough. Okay. Actually, it's raining. Then knocked. There was motion inside. Something fell. Someone cursed. There was laughter. The door opened and a man with colorless eyes scowled at them, then immediately smiled. Kirina! He hugged her, transferring the wet clay from his shirt and pants and hand onto her robes. And you are the young man who fell off a mountain, he greeted Tibbs after putting it down. Tibbs, this is... He trailed off, trying to remember the name the cleric had given him. Tibbs realized. Paul, Tibbs said. That's the name he said to us. He said to use. She blushed. Right, Paul. If you are bringing him to my home, I think we've moved beyond aliases, Kirina. And I doubt Zachariah would stick to calling me that. He gave Tibbs a slight bow. I am Paolo Whatblood, cleric, purveyor of our words, protector of our honor. I'm Tibbs, he hesitated. Rogue. Paolo smiled. Simplicity does have its place. Please, come in. He stepped out of the way. On the other side of the room that made up the entire floor, someone picked up lumps of clay off the floor next to an overturned table. Forgive the mess. You startled me while I was turning clay. When did you start working with clay? Rena asked. Hi, Zach. It's good to see you again. The man, no, woman? Tibbs couldn't decide. They had the square shoulder and hips of a man, but also breasts. When they answered Kirina, their voice was deep, but carried a lightness Tibbs associated with women. In a way, they reminded him somewhat of the newer version of bigger brutes, though it used a front chuckle. Paolo crossed the room and pulled them to their feet with an amused giggle, then kissed their temple. Stop it, they said, pretending to push him away. Guests. And now our visitors can understand you. Oh, they smiled and curtsied. I am Zachariah. It's a pleasure to meet you. Did you say your name was Tibbs? Did you say your name is Tibbs? Yes. It's a lovely name. Tibbs realized he was blushing. Thank you. Paolo straightened the table and Tibs focused on the top of it, which was spinning. He didn't understand what about them made him uncomfortable. No, the opposite. They put him at ease in a way he'd only felt for in Water's presence. Only their eyes were green of grass with flecks of gold that seemed to light up when they smiled. It's rather early for you to have reached Epsilon, Yellow said. Then to Zachariah, still fussing with the clay on the floor. Karina never cared, and her friend's a runner like her. A messy floor won't bother him. They reluctantly stood. Should I get us wine? Yellow looked at Karina. Please, she said. I don't know how much I've missed it. He shrugged. He'd drink what was offered. He left, and Paolo motioned to a set of slow stool. Now, what brings you both to our humble home? Tibbs needs help. Needs your help. Karina answered. He has to get into the dungeon. He wants purity as his element. And that concludes chapter 56 of Stepping Up. If you are enjoying it, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next one's going to be posted, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read ahead, it's available on Royal Road for free. If you want to support me and read further ahead, that's on Patreon. And if you want to listen to me do these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.